If you want to fight this, you have to destroy what they've done to the legal system. And you have to simplify the legal system back to a position where people can easily and readily understand it.
On British thought leaders, Steven Barrett says to fix Britain, we need to fix our bloated laws.
It damages your society because literally nobody knows what the laws are because there are simply too many. So one of the major tasks in getting us back is going to be deleting vast amounts of law that we don't need.
Steven talks about two-tier justice, the Fabian society, and rebuilding public trust in our legal system.
I really do want ordinary people who are non-lawyers just to know that law is the consistent application of rules, so you can spot when it's breaking down yourself. If you get inconsistent outcomes and you can look at it and go, hang on a second, that's dodgy, then you know there is an innateness to it.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with barrister, legal commentator and constitutional expert Steven Barrett. Steven, thanks for joining us.
Not at all. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So before we dive into legal stuff, I wanted to ask you about another issue. We saw the tragic killing of Charlie Kirk.
Yes.
There's been other things happening as well. It feels like society is somewhat in turmoil. Violence, hatred are becoming a bit more mainstream.
Yes.
How do we get back to civilised debate and talking with people that we disagree with?
So, I mean, that is the big question now, and the answer from a legal side is to regain control of the legal system, because effectively it's become so bloated that almost nobody, and I include myself in this, I can't do all of it. It's just huge. It's unbelievably huge. People seem to have an innate understanding that if you print money, you cause inflation. If you just constantly print laws, you cause another type of evil or wrongness. And I don't know what the word is for it, maybe lawflation, or I don't know what the word should be, but it damages your society because literally nobody knows what the laws are because there are simply too many. So one of the major tasks in getting us back is going to be deleting vast amounts of law that we don't need and simplifying the language of the law that we do need. Nobody wants to delete the law against murder. That would be a very bad idea. It's a terribly rough weekend we'd all have. So we don't want to be doing that. But we do need to get a grip and a handle on our legal system. And I mean, you can say that this has been done deliberately or incompetently, and it doesn't matter which one it is. So with so many of our politicians at the moment, it really doesn't matter whether they're lying or stupid. They're one or the other, and determining which one they are is largely a waste of time. What they've done is they've allowed this system to come into being, which is, by the way, very profitable for lawyers. So one of the few types of people who profit from it are my lot. And I always feel it's slightly funny that I'm actually doing it, or I'm interested in fixing things because of my commitment to law academically. So when you constantly print new laws, endless laws, and you write them really badly, which is what's going on. We have something called the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, which drafts our laws, and they draft things really very, very badly. So we've just got a new regime in data protection. And I gave up even reading the Act after about section 6, because all it did, section after section, was the minister shall make a law that does, makes puppies happy. The minister shall pass a law that makes kittens, gleeful with delight. And it's like this declaratory style of nonsense. It's like, what is your law? What is the law? What is the rule? And they're killing the thing that I love intellectually and academically with all of these words. They're drowning it in words. I took a fellow podcaster through Ofcom, because Ofcom's a great example of how it's killed rules with words. The Ofcom so there's a thing called impartiality.
Yeah.
And I've got a definition. I can draft it for you like a good, proper, old school lawyer, like they all were 40 years ago. I could draft that impartiality rule for you, and believe me, it works. And if you apply it consistently to everybody, then you'd get a consistent outcome, and that would be fair and what we might call justice. But instead, Ofcom have bloated the definition of impartiality. It's huge now. It's bloated in the 2003 Communications Act, and it's bloated in Ofcom's own words. And Ofcom's invented this thing called due impartiality, which effectively comes down to a thing is impartial except when it isn't.
Easy.
That's not a law. That's not a rule. That's just nonsense. An orange is an orange except when it's not. That's just, and this is what they've been doing, and they do it because it gives them a lot of control. So Ofcom therefore is allowed to interpret that rule and say, well, something GB News did, I don't like them. They're not Fabian Marxists, so they've got to be wrong uns. That's not due impartiality. But Ed Ball's interviewing his wife. Oh, that's perfectly due impartiality. Well done, ITV. And you just sat there going, what? What? That? I mean, and I really do want ordinary people who are non-lawyers just to know that law is the consistent application of rules. So you can spot when it's breaking down yourself. If you get inconsistent outcomes and you can look at it and go, hang on a second, that's dodgy, then you know. There is an innateness to it. And there's something beautiful about our law, because what it was doing for 800 years was trying to be, and it's one of the reasons we don't teach it in schools. Now, a solution to this problem might be to teach law in schools and to engage in it more. And where we are today, the solution I have is that I go on things like this and I explain law to people, hopefully in an accessible way, so that they can get it, because leaving it outside their grasp is not safe. Okay, it's a very dangerous thing, and the idea the experts will look after it and you people just sit down and know your place is such an abusive relationship. So we have to get it back. But the long-term solution is probably what our legal system used to do, certainly before we joined the EU, which is we were literally like stalking ordinary people, trying to work out what they thought normal was and what they thought rules should be. Right. So, the law against murder isn't created in Parliament. A judge just goes, people don't seem to like this murdering thing. Yep, it's definitely illegal. And it's it's trying to reflect society. So we got a bit lazy and we don't teach it in schools because our old legal system, not today, because it's been full of bloat today. But if you go back 40 years, 50 years, our old legal system just literally represented what most people thought anyway. So you didn't need to be taught law because you just have common sense. Now, we still had expert lawyers to do specific things, to handle trials in the case of crime or even in civil. And in my commercial division, to deal with new and emerging problems, because people, particularly bankers and financiers or new corporations or businesses, invent new problems that the legal system's never encountered before. So at the very fringes of the legal system, you should always have these brand new things. It's like AI. Oh God, who's going to be responsible for this? And then somebody has to work that out, and it has to be dealt with. But they're always, think of law like a giant tree. They're at the very limits of its leaves. The changes should be there. And what has gone on now is that tree has been allowed to grow wild and is huge. And they only ever want to focus on the core of the trunk, which is these things called human rights, which are basic. I mean, they're not, I don't even consider, they're like beginner's law. They're like learning, when I taught my child how to read, and you get in the simplest of books. Really, that's what human rights are, because it shouldn't even be in any way interesting or contentious to say that human beings have a right to life. That's obvious. So I don't need to be having these discussions. The right to not be tortured. Well, in our country, we decided that you had a right to not be tortured, or that we wouldn't torture you, because we often do it the other way around. We often don't say that you have a right. We say the state can't. We put a duty on the state rather than a right on the individual. But in our country, we did that in about the 1700s. So, this is beginner level stuff. And when you learn law, you learn the tree branch. You think of each branch as a different area of law, and you learn the basics, and then you move on. And practicing, as I used to, should be at the far edges of the leaves. But I came to understand that there really is just such a danger in the middle. This idea of human rights is becoming very, very corrupting to law. I don't even consider it really law.
So like the core is going rotten.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's a very dangerous state for any society to be. I also realise that some people who purport to be very senior or serious lawyers are not. So one of the things that I simply cannot get my head around, which I don't mind explaining to your listeners and viewers, is that there is no legal argument to pay to give away the Chagos Islands.
Really?
None. Okay, so even on its own terms, there is no legal argument. And the reason for that is that Lord Hermer, who's our Attorney General, would say, well, the International Court of Justice might make a ruling saying that we have to give away our islands, so we'll give them away before that ruling happens.
Just in case.
But that's his argument.
Right.
When we join, firstly, we don't have to be in that court, so we could just leave. Secondly, if they did that, we could pass an act of parliament saying no. No, not at all. And thirdly, when we joined that court, we said we're only joining it on the basis that you won't consider issues relating to the former imperial territories. So we specifically carved them out.
Yeah.
So if the ICJ does its job and follows that law, because that's a law and it should follow that law, the ICJ can never make a determination that we should give away the Chagos Islands because it's bound by that. So there is no danger of a ruling forcing us to give away the Chagos Islands. And yet Lord Hermer has apparently advised the cabinet, and it is the position of His Majesty's government, that we must, because of law, give away the Chagos Islands and pay to give them away and to completely betray the islanders.
What do you say is behind that? Is that kind of lawfare or?
No, I think it's a madness. I think it's a cult-like madness that has taken over our government. I talk now increasingly about Fabianism and the Fabians because they're a great conspiracy. They're never a conspiracy theory because they put it all on their website. They sort of do it all in the open, but they don't like being caught. Lord Hermer is a Fabian, and this will be part of some cultural Marxist belief that probably around reparations. The thing about Fabians is you often don't know what their policies are in detail because they like to just drone on. So you don't actually get you never really get clarity with a Fabian. But there's a sort of vague feeling that this government is pro-reparations but won't admit it. In exactly the same way that this government is pro-state killing. So it's pro the eugenics bill, the idea that the weak, the disabled, the elderly, the depressed will go to the NHS and say, please kill me.
Or the assisted dying.
Yeah, and they like that. But they because they're Fabians, they literally can never tell the truth. It's not that they lie. I think they're just completely incapable of telling the truth.
This was the wolf in sheep's clothing logo.
Yeah, wolf in sheep's clothing people. Right. The people who genuinely, I mean, George Bernard Shaw allowed himself to be filmed was quite proud to say that he didn't hate anybody, but he certainly wanted to see an awful lot of people dead. Really? And he said that everybody should go before a committee once every 5 years to justify to that committee why you got to carry on living. And so if you were sick or infirm or dependent on the state, or an orphan, and a child who doesn't have parents to look after it, then you would be killed. These people it's a very warped, grotesque worldview. And it comes, as I say, entirely out of what's called utilitarianism, which is like humanity without the humanity. There's just no, and this is why they are often godless. They often reject God, and they're often atheistic, because it's in contrast with any sort of basic religion, because most religions tend to believe that you have some sort of immortality to you, some sort of value in you towards divinity. I mean, I'm a Christian in the Church of England, so I believe everybody is an immutable soul, and that is of value to God, and that's why you look after people, and we all, form a community and we care for our vulnerable, we don't kill them. But if you're a Fabian and you believe in utilitarianism, then the ends justify the means. That person costs you a lot of money to keep them alive, so you may as well just kill them. So the Weimar Republic went into this, and then Hitler just becomes an extension of it. So once you've got eugenics for disabled people, perhaps people suffering mental health problems, perhaps people of low IQs, perhaps the elderly, or anybody who's deformed in an accident, or the depressed. Once you've got death for them,
we're seeing that in several countries already, right?
Yes, and we are. Yes, the awful thing is that I'm not being alarmist because this is happening. Canada is an absolute disgrace, but once you've got them, it's not. And if you create another group, as they often do, and particularly utilitarians like to throw Jews under the bus, it's a very short hop to say, well, it must be awful to be them, probably be better off dead. And that's where, this is where we march to with utilitarianism. Everybody has to prove their value to the state. Everybody is just a meat unit. And I really, really want us to go back, if I can, get us to basic Christianity. But that's not my job. I'm not the Archbishop of Canterbury or the King, nor am I even a vicar. So it's just not my job to look after people's souls. I'd like that. I think it'd be nice. But my job is as a lawyer to say that if you want to fight this, you have to destroy what they've done to the legal system. And you have to simplify the legal system back to a position where people can easily and readily understand it.
How realistic is that?
It depends on the will to do it. I think people will wake up. So what you'll get is the first stage is that people will say, that is a bit dodgy. I reckon we should get rid of that act.
I was saying, say, with ECHR and things like that.
Fine. So I was a thing this morning where they were saying the ECHR. I met there a lovely friend who runs a brilliant anti-racism charity, which is genuinely not racist, and called Don't Divide Us. And their bugbear is the Equality Act. So people will come to that's the first step, I think. People will come, they'll get one thing and they'll go, that's not right. And there are other acts that you can name that will become the sort of obvious acts. But you remember I mentioned that Data Protection Act.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to pick that one because nobody's going to read that one. You know, the only people reading that are the people paid to be a data protection expert. I always like to think that, so I had a mild expertise in financial services law, and we in financial services were burdened with this thing called the consumer duty. And nobody knew what it was. And everybody read it and nobody could work out what on earth it meant. So we had this new thing being implemented across all the financial services. Every compliance department had to deal with it. And people were giving seminars basically just hoping that they could pretend or bluff their way through it, pretending that they were the expert in what the consumer duty meant, because literally no one else knew what this consumer duty meant. And again, I don't think the consumer duty in financial services will get this attention, but people will pick the sort of specific acts that just don't make sense to them. The gender recognition stuff will come out, and it doesn't. And so that's stage one. Realising that there's one act of Parliament that doesn't work and is rubbish and is flabby, and you can't understand it, so you want it gone. Stage two is realising that there's loads of them, hundreds of them. And actually, we need to repeal huge swathes of this. You know, the whole thing, a lot of the, like Ofcom, so the Communications Act 2003. Again, I don't think anybody other than me is likely to pick that as a bugbear, but eventually people are going to notice, do you know what, we need to get rid of this Communications Act. We need to get rid of Ofcom. Fergal Sharkey's is a great crusader for cleanliness in rivers. Now, that's all because of that regulatory regime, and that will have statutory backing and statutes that need to go. Right. If you're going to ever stop sewage in rivers, you've got to get rid of all of these laws because the laws are gumming up the entire system. If your listeners and viewers can understand it, huge amounts of public money are wasted on all of this. This is probably the greatest waste in our society right now. After, you know, the welfare bill is very huge, and the government employment bill, but the government only employs so many people because we have so many laws. Right. So the governments all need a data protection officer, and they all need, you know, all of these things, and the water regulators need to have, and the whole shebang, the bureaucracy goes on and on. It's not a new human phenomena. There's nothing new under the sun. Humans always repeat the same mistakes. The Eastern Roman Empire fixed itself in the beginning in about 600 AD by deleting loads of laws and slimming down its system and creating a better one. And then 800 years later, when it hadn't realized it needed to do the same again, it ends up dying, and its name becomes synonymous with this. Being Byzantine is synonymous with unnecessary complexity. And that's what we have. We now have a Byzantine legal system, which
How do we get there from the 50 years ago where people were comfortable with the law to now?
I have never seen so much legal printing in my life. So if you sit in an old school law library, as I did as a child, I mean, there's lots online now, but there's something quite good about sitting in a law library. There are three main sections to a law library. Textbooks, well, don't worry about them. Then there's case law, well, don't worry about that. The problem specifically has been statutes. So you sit there and there will be shelves of statutes, and they'll go back to something like 1840 or something. And you just watch them, boom, 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 boom. And they're quite thin. And then about the 80s or the late 70s, they start getting quite thick. Right. So literally the war ones are like the whole 5 years of the war are about that thick. because they just weren't making any law because they had a water fight. You know, so you end up with periods that some periods are busier, some periods are less busy, and you can sort of see this. But basically, they're just one little book, one little book, one little book. And then in about the late 70s or the early 80s, they start to get quite big. I'm pretty sure it's around the mid-90s. It's either 1992 or 1995 is the first one to have 2 volumes. Right. So they're 2 massive volumes. And then you've got massive volumes. And if you look ever since then, there's just been so much new law printed. It's unbelievable. The amount of new criminal offences created since 2000 and now is more than all the criminal offences that existed before the year 2000. Really? Now, the EU does it too. Okay, so we need to admit this. So a lot of those laws are not Tony Blair going mad. A lot of them were drafted in Europe. And the EU would say, and the EU is really bad at drafting laws. I have a friend inside it. He's very pro-EU. I don't want to get him sacked or he's very pro-EU. But he and I will have a giggle about how badly they draft laws. And there are very specific ways to draft laws. They use so many more words than you need. And the reason that they do it, in their defense, they would say, well, look, we're trying to manage 28 different member states. It's like herding cats. Yeah. We just write vague laws that they can then interpret into their system. And as long as we broadly have agreement, we'll advance the European cause. Yeah. But they also have a mechanism that we don't have in this country, when they have a pet court. So their courts, their European Court of Justice, will do what the Commission says and will say, read a text that says an apple is an orange and go, yeah, an apple is a banana, because that's what the Commission want it to say. Now, our judges are too honest. They're too good to do that. So they won't necessarily be biased in favour of any government. And that's a problem when you have that system of too many laws that are too vague. I'd love to get Ofcom's due impartiality before a judge. I know that GB News did actually JR Ofcom, and Ofcom lost. Because it's just like, what is this? And we had a lovely... so to try and keep us inside the ECHR, the civil service under Rishi Sunak, because I think it is a civil service. Let's stop blaming the politicians. They don't really know what's going on. The civil service did something. They incorporated something called the Belfast Agreement into law. Now, before that, in 1998, back when we could still draft law well, you had the Belfast Agreement, a diplomatic text. And then Parliament went away and wrote the 1998 Northern Ireland Act, a legal text. Legal text, which is tight on language, not flabby, not clear as to what it means, so that you can have an operation. Diplomatic text, which is really just lovely words about kindness and hugging rabbits and everybody being happy and kind and no one murdering anybody anymore, which is a good thing. But nobody in 1998 would have ever put the diplomatic text into law. They would have never made it law. They deliberately went away and wrote something else that was law. And then with the Windsor Framework, I think deliberately to stop us leaving the ECHR, a civil servant had the grand idea to pull it into law. So it literally says, oh, this is now law. This diplomatic document is now legal text. And we got a Northern Irish High Court judge going, I don't understand what this means. He literally said, this is written as diplomatic speak. This is not supposed to be law. How am I supposed to interpret this? Because it's just woolly. And I don't know if I can get that across to non-lawyers, that it's just, if you write aspirational, nice, kind, loving things, that's great. But what's the rule? What's the rule, mate? I need to know what the rule is. I remember, because law is just the process of applying rules consistently. But I like that example because I think it shows where we've got to. They're desperate for us to not leave the ECHR. They're desperate to maintain this level of legal confusion, the lack of legal clarity, because it gives them power.
Would you say that the rule of law is kind of collapsing?
Yes, but this is the tragedy of Fabians, is that they never get the communist utopia they hope for. They just cause state collapse. Yeah. Because ultimately, whilst it's great from their point of view that they can get a disproportionate outcome, or maybe they could have protected Angela Rayner, in 5 years' time, and they'll be even more powerful and they'll be able to get all sorts of more disproportionate outcomes, simply because nobody will be able to point to a law and say, actually, that law applies and you must do it consistently. But we have an entire economy. Our lives are not the government. Our government should actually be quite an irrelevant part of our lives. We've got to get on having an economy, buying and selling stuff, trading, doing... And if we can't do any of that because we're all like, what am I supposed to do? It's like the planning system is so bloated and broken. It's exactly the same phenomena, and it's not always sinister. So when our Office of Parliamentary Counsel, who draft laws, they simply started to drift to a European style because they were very exposed to Europe, and they weren't told to keep to a tight style. They weren't. I was not disciplined, but trained specifically as a young chancery barrister to keep very tight on language and drafting. They're not, and that happened about 25 years ago. So anybody who works in that office now is absolutely inculcated in European drafting and is probably incapable of drafting clearly, or you'd have to basically re-educate them in order to make them do it. So it's not always sinister when they do this. I doubt the planning system is a particularly sinister thing. This is just what happens when you have Fabians. It's just the inevitable result that they create absolute chaos because they don't tell the truth and they don't want to be clear. And they won't. If you have a society where everyone's lying and there's no legal clarity as to what the rule is, that's going to collapse. It's not going to be a communist utopia. They're not going to get there. But we need to be aware of this because it is very dangerous. State collapse is not amusing. It's not fun. We've seen political violence in the United States. It's very likely we will see political violence here. We already have black masked Marxists on the streets. That's not too worrying. In Weimar Germany, the far more worrying time was when the brown-shirted fascists rose to oppose them. So we must get those Marxists under control long before the shouty man comes. And I want our country to go back to being a beautiful capitalistic democracy. And the way that you do that, and we're not capitalist at the moment, we're corporatist. So the law itself is being used to prevent competition in the markets. Right. The purpose of most insurance regulatory law is not what it claims to be. It is to prevent there being competitors in the insurance market. The purpose of most banking regulatory law is to prevent new banks arising, competing with the new banks. And then the old banks have to march to the tune of the government. That's the relationship. It's this very close corporate socialist relationship that the Fabians create, where they will use the power of the state to stop you ever facing competition, but you have to pay them large amounts of money in tax and you have to dance to their tunes. But as long as you do that, they're absolutely fine. The problem is us. This lovely little conspiracy between large corporates and the government sort of completely cuts out human beings. So we're having a rubbish time, and you'll experience it with everything. Your listeners and viewers will have experienced in their own lifetimes, the degradation of call helplines. Yeah. AI is a symptom of the problem. Okay, AI has arisen because innocent computer coding people, who I often have a lot of respect for, and I think computer coding is very similar to the law, have looked at the situation and gone, yeah, it's really complicated. We need a way of simplifying this for everybody. But it's not the answer, because the answer is having a much simpler system where you don't, we can't get to a stage where AI is emailing itself. That's just not good, But if I go on my Hotmail account, Microsoft kindly offers me to summarize the email that I was sent and then to compose another. This is just symptomatic of the problem. And actually, if we let AI loose, it will just escalate beyond all boundaries. The physical limitations of the world need to come back in some way, shape or form. The fact that laws went online did not help anybody. So part of the flabbiness comes from the fact that, a Word document doesn't take up very much space on a modern hard drive and can be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. That's how you end up with the new government's employment regulations, which are going to crush business, prevent competition, prevent small players arising because they simply won't be able to comply with all the laws, so they're effectively crushed out of all position, and create an extra regulatory burden on big companies, so they'll lay off staff, and it's really going to damage the economy. But it's 120,000 words. If you had to write those by hand, you wouldn't write 100.
Copy them out.
Yeah. But instead, because we can just sit there and type, they've just sat there and typed. And if in the old days, if it's 120,000 words, which I think is about 330 pages or something like that, people would be going, I haven't got the paper for that. You can't have that. I can't fit that in. What about this? There are real practical, and I like to often think about these. I call them the practicalities of the Constitution. So we have exactly the same problem with our judges now, and they just waffle. I'd hate to learn law now because it takes me a very short amount of time to read most cases, because I know that I can just go ignore. Okay, that matters. But you can't have that skill. I didn't have that skill when I was 19. So I have a huge pity for 19-year-olds trying to learn law now. But again, the judges, they just waffle, because in the old days, like the law lords in Parliament, they literally had one secretary between two.
Right.
And so these are old men, because they were just all men then, handwriting their judgment. So that's a sort of physical constraint on the Constitution right there. Then they're giving it to their secretary, who's already run off her feet. And she's like, oh, he's drafted for you. You've got to cut that down. There's just going to be the practical constraints on the Constitution, which have now all gone. Now the Supreme Court justices sit in the Supreme Court. They have clerks who will draft things for them and type for them. They can do their own typing if they want to. And this is why you're getting sort of 400-page cases.
So those traditional ways were like guardrails.
Yes, they were guardrails for the Constitution to keep everything simple. And the other thing was this overarching principle that the law should reflect what ordinary people already think. We have this marvellous figure in the law who emerges, he emerges long before, but he's, I think, most poetically captured as the man on the Clapham omnibus. And this concept of the man who gets on the bus, what we now call a bus, that used to be called an omnibus, at Clapham to go into the city to do work. He's just the reasonable man.
Yeah.
And he's morphed over the years. He's become the man on the tube, now the man or woman on the tube. And, but this concept of the reasonable person, what does the reasonable person expect the law to be like? And that has gone, sadly. A lot of the time, the very idea that you would draft laws in that way has simply died, because it couldn't. Then again, the Europeans don't have it, and that was a very British word called reasonableness. So I can get very obsessive about a single word, because that's what lawyers do. A single word is very, very important to us, and this very British sense of the word reasonableness guided us through the common law and created a good, happy, safe country that was Fabian free. Importing another word has caused more chaos than almost anything else. Everything I've described, which is very harmful and very damaging, a lot of the blame can be laid at the feet of one word, and that's called proportionality.
Right.
Okay, so proportionality is not a word known to English law. It's foreign. It's EU idea, and it gives judges ridiculous amounts of power. Because rather than saying, as they used to say in judicial review, is the action by the government minister so unreasonable that no reasonable minister could have done it? Really high bar, that, isn't it? That's just not... Very little, very seldom are the judges going to interfere in politics if the bar is that high. And instead, they now say, well, was it proportionate?
Yeah. What about civil justice? Is this accessible still to ordinary folk, would you say?
No, in my entire life, the bar has been rising. Called How Little Money Do You Let Slide and Think It's Not Worth Suing Over? And sadly, that number now is really quite high. I mean, I doubt most businesses would sue for anything less than 50 grand. When I was a baby barrister, there was just coming this idea of the small claims court, and that was at 10 grand.
Right.
Or 5 grand, now it's 10 grand. Might be higher, I haven't looked at the small claims in a very long time. But realistically, to employ, when I was back at the bar and practicing, realistically, it would be a waste of money to have me on a case that was less than 400, 500,000. And you'd want it to be larger than that to justify my expense, because the cost of my type of case going all the way to trial tended to be around 400,000, 500,000. So why would you do that if you're going to spend if you're going to win, but you're going to give all the money to your lawyers? Yeah. In theory, you get costs when you win, but they changed the clarity of that just as I was coming in 2003, and now in practice, judges tend to give about 65%, which is hugely different. I mean, I just go back to a very simple rule saying that if the winner pays the loser's damages, that's it.
That sounds common sense.
Exactly, and that would allow access to justice, because in cases where you've obviously been wronged, lawyers would be much more confident saying things like, well, I'll do it for free until we get to the result, because I know that I'll get paid and I'll get 100% of my cost.
Yeah.
But they make these situations unattractive because they add in this complexity. They don't want clear rules. And it may just be that they have some sort of like allergic reaction to them. That Fabians, I don't know, maybe they in turn were over-parented as children. So they had lots and lots of rules when they were children, and therefore they grew up to hate rules. So they're like, now we will have no rules. I don't know. I'm speculating, but they just don't like clear rules. And the lack of clear rules means that civil justice is really not. I don't think it's accessible to anybody, really. Not normal people. My clients used to be the high net worth and ultra high net worth of the world, which we're very good at, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's anything sinful in that, because it pays a lot of tax money and it's very good for our jurisdiction, but we should have access to ordinary courts for ordinary people. One of my particular bugbears is that I'd like the magistrates back, because I think magistrates were quick and efficient and pretty commonsensical. And if you got into a 10 grand, 15 grand dispute with a plumber, and you could pop down, and both of you were in the same town, say, I live in a town, you pop down a building in the local town, which is the magistrate's court, and you say, we're going to have this dispute, and then you give it a really simple structure, and then you just have everybody come on it. So you just assigned a day. Okay, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to come, we're assigning you a day, you'll give your evidence, you'll give your evidence, and we'll just resolve the dispute. That's not what we do. We try, and every attempt to simplify it every attempt by judges or a committee of judges to reduce legal costs has increased legal costs. Right. Okay, this is where committees get you. This is where communist society goes. This is what socialism does. But I think that's why I pair it right back to the magistracy. You don't need to produce expensive witness statements, which inevitably mean you're going to use a lawyer. There's a lot of expensive things that you could just take them out of the system and make a really refined process for ordinary people. Now, in its defense, this government would say, or the civil service, because it really doesn't matter who's in government, the civil service would say, well, we're doing that, Stephen, because we've been working for the last 8 years on AI. And it's like, yes, you have, but that's not what I want. I think people and justice demands a human touch. Replacing access to, if you say to ordinary people, just put your complaints into AI and the AI will pick which you win, but the very, very wealthy people and Prince Harry get to go to court as often as they want and be in front of a human judge, I think you're really causing some sort of rift in our society that I don't like.
Oh, that sounds too tear.
Well, exactly. And I am very Victorian, or I understand the wisdom of the Victorians. The Victorians are very fascinating people because within living memory, they had a prime minister assassinated with a pistol. There were something like 6 attempts on Queen Victoria's own life during her reign. Oh yeah, no, but they dealt with all of this they realised that what you have to do is you have to calm it all down. You can't have rich people living behind high gates. So they didn't do that. They had rich people living where poor people lived, and poor people lived where rich people lived. And often they shared houses because that was, the role of the poor person was to be the maid or the, and so Downton Abbey they do all mix, and it wasn't all just Downton Abbey, but even a little terraced house would have, 1 or 2 members of staff and the family, and then they'd all go down to church on Sunday together. And of course, the wealthy people might well sit in the better pews, but we're all in church together, we're all singing the same hymns, we're all hearing the same lesson from we're all praying together, we're all part of something together. And the Victorians did things like, in Parliament, have a public gallery. And they didn't have a screen to protect anybody. They could have been shot at from the public gallery, but they knew that if you involve the public, you actually defang these problems. Right. And part of a collapsing society will see elite retreating behind fences, gates and walls. So I happened to watch a popular news channel upon which I may appear last night, and I noticed there were lots of adverts for very expensive gates and security gates. Right. And I was just like, oh, is this what happened? So we didn't have the gates on Downing Street when I was born, but we got them pretty soon afterwards. And Parliament has just erected a massive fence around itself.
People are calling it South Africanisation, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's a really bad idea. I mean, I always think that the French did it the first and worse with Versailles. You know, they literally retreated away from the common people. They were just going to live in a palace on their own. It's like, you do realise they'll work out where you are and they will burn it down. Ultimately, the Victorians knew that if wealthy people simply retreat and hide, it's not going to work because there's always going to be more of them than you.
Yeah.
You know, it's that simple balance, and that's why you create a decent society where nobody is inclined to attack you. Nobody is. The rich are not hated because there's all sorts of things where very wealthy people can do that will make them much more loved, and that you work on that and you show service. I mean, the old House of Lords was brilliant because the richest people, up until industrialisation, the richest people in the country are going to be the people who own all the land. And the House of Lords said, congratulations, you're done very well. You're now one of the richest people in the land. You will now work for your country. You will review legislation, which can be very boring. I mean, even I don't pretend it's interesting all the time. You know, it can be deathly dull. You will vote, you will turn up, you will go to these ceremonies, you will do this, you will do that. Compare and contrast that with somebody like the life of Madonna or Elton John, which is a very, very wealthy person, and I'm not taking away from their merits, but then entirely set free to live entirely as they wish. And, that can go as perverted. And I'm not saying I don't want either. I actually quite like both of them. So I don't want either of them connected with the next person I'm going to mention, which is Jeffrey Epstein. You know, again, a very wealthy person who can basically live however he lives. And so he goes into evil and darkness. Whereas the Victorians were like, no, our very wealthy people will sit in that building, they will review legislation, they will work. And of course they might have taken themselves seriously, although I've got a friend who is a hereditary peer. And it was I just had lunch with him recently, and it was very sweet because his sister, and he just said, I don't know if you know my sister, but my sister's got a proper peerage. And it's like, what he meant by that was that his sister had earned it by being very a high achiever in her field. I think she's a doctor. And therefore she'd been granted a peerage because of her achievements. Whereas he's just, I just inherited mine by birth. And there is something to that. That's a very nice constitutional check. Again, when I talk about these constitutional checks that we've lost, losing the hereditaries worries me, it plays on my mind, because I think we've replaced them with a House of Lords that thinks it belongs there. A bunch of humans who think that they're better than everybody else are going to behave badly.
We saw this Banksy recently.
Yes.
There's an unidentified person on the floor getting bashed by a judge.
Yeah.
I was thinking people on the right would be like, oh, that's us, two-tier justice, we're losing our rights. People on the left would be like, oh, that's us, two-tier justice, we're losing our rights. In how big of an issue do you think two-tier justice is? And in your impartial legal mind, who is the victim of it?
Both. I think there is a reflection of that both have legitimate complaint. I think the state is being quite tyrannical. I think much more on the right, or even not the right, ordinary people.
Right.
I mean, I don't think that. I talked to some of the survivors from Southport, and I don't think they'd self-identify as Tories. So they're not right-wing. These are old traditional Labour people, but they were particularly badly treated by this two-tier justice system. And remember how ridiculous it was that Suella Braverman was forced to resign for even admitting it existed. Well, we're well beyond that. It obviously exists now. And it's because a small elite are desperately trying to keep control, and they will fail because unless they adopt good Victorian principles and learn to live amongst everybody, recognise that rules apply to them and rules apply to everybody, and enforce the rule of law and have clear legal systems, ultimately the people will get, I call it, how many times can you hit a man in Waitrose with your trolley before you die? Okay? So I don't know if you know this is my theory, but so if you have listeners and viewers from abroad, they would be astonished to know, I suspect. But if you hit a man in Waitrose with your trolley, and Waitrose is a very upmarket, a supermarket, but the first thing that happens is that he says sorry to you.
Yeah.
That's the first thing that happens. He doesn't mean it at all. But he says it because that's what we do. And that's how being British is. The next thing is probably to ignore it, then to tut, then maybe cough and clear your throat, and then go deathly still. and very, very quiet.
So we're on hit 5 by now.
Yeah, and at a certain point, you're going to die. If you hit him again with your trolley, you're going to die. And I really think that's where our elite are now. I think they're just, because again, how absolutely stupid to wipe away that Banksy and then leave an even more moving image.
It looks better.
It looks better. Well, it looks more tyrannical. It looks more evil.
A lot of the rings.
Yeah, it's like this. Just you people are just sinister now, and I think it's going to become very difficult to almost defend the elite from themselves. I think we might need quite a big clear out at a certain point, and I look forward to a future government fixing the current chaos. I don't think we will do what the French do, which is chop off all their heads and bathe in their blood, because we're British and we don't do that. But I also think we're past the point where they're just going to get away with it now, because I think it's just they've hit us too many times with that trolley. And far too many people are too upset. I don't know how we legitimately reconcile Lucy Connolly's punishment. I think it would be very good for the country if Lucy Connolly were pardoned. I think that would release a lot of tension in the country. And we've never been obsessive about the rule of law. So we've always had this idea that, well, in some circumstances, that's okay. So if you're speeding, but your wife's in labour and is about to give birth, then okay, just go on. Or that sort of softness.
Natural decency.
Yes, basic decency and that sort of softness. Now that has been hijacked. So those discretionary powers are now used by highly politicised police to only use discretion or give kindness based on identity politics. Which again will just cause much more tension and is much more likely to cause a state collapse. I don't think we'll get to state collapse, because even if we're in total rule of law collapse here, we'll still queue. And there are basics to being British that I think cannot be taken away. I think they are. I think our roots are deep and old. So I think we will be okay. But I doubt we're going to preserve the current elite in any way, shape, or form. And I think we'll just have to see where we go. But again, not be vindictive. One of the great things I'd like to do is to get, as I said, the church back. So the idea of forgiveness is quite integral to the church. So I hope that's where we get. But I think other societies will get much, because the same problem is repeated across the West.
No.
And other societies will get a bit more violent than we will. I mean, already the French are burning things down. I hope to not see arson in this country, but we're going where we're going until we get better, and we need to get better, and I hope we will do that. And as I've tried to explain, there's a huge legal element to that, deleting and simplifying and rewriting the laws we want to keep. Because that needs to happen just so that everyone can understand things. I live next to a business. I'm not going to tell you what type of business it is, but it's a very sweet business. It's a private business. It does good work. They're kind people, and I'm pretty sure that they're criminals and they're committing a regulatory offence. I don't think they have the slightest clue that they're committing a regulatory offence. Right. What we should do is delete that regulatory offence, or make it so it never could apply to them. That is the commonsensical way to run a country. I think a lot of the time we have accidental criminality in this country, which is not healthy. And then we also need to enforce basic rule of law. So you will have experienced today, as every Londoner has experienced, the sheer illegality of cyclists.
Wow, every day.
I mean, it's just unbelievable. And we're going to have to enforce laws against cyclists. So we're going to have to do sort of two things: fix the legal system and then simplify it to make it fairer, but then enforce what we've got left.
That used to just be basic decency.
Yes.
You wouldn't, when I'm crossing the zebra crossing, you wouldn't try and run me over.
No.
But that's gone now.
Well, it has gone now, but I think that can come back if we enforce it. So I always think of New York in the 80s. It was very, very dangerous and aggressive. And that mayor managed to fix New York. And if he can fix that, I think we can fix this.
Okay.
I also think that culture is a collective experience. And I think if we start banging on about it more, people will buy in. Like, the young people want to belong to something, so give them a culture to belong to. And a lot of the time, the frustrations from the young are because the system is so bad for them. A lot of them are taking on black-clad masks and dyeing half their hair purple and screaming about whatever the latest thing to scream about is, because they can't get a well-paying job, they have no prospect of owning a home, and they're not going to have kids. Now, those are fundamentals for humans, and we need to build a society where they can afford to have good jobs, they can afford to buy homes, and they can have children. And that will be a much better society. Once we do that, it will be a lot better.
We had former police officer Paul Birch on, and he was saying to rise up the ranks in the police force, you have to evidence that you support kind of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and a kind of woke agenda. Is it the same in your area?
Yes. It's the same in everyone's area of law. This is what they've done. This is corporate socialism. This is Fabianism. This is what they've done. So if I'm not going to be a KC ever under the current system, because to be a KC under the current system, not only do I have to fill in a massive form, Fabians love bureaucracy and words, but in that form I have to evidence my commitment to DEI. And I'm never going to be a judge, because to be a judge, in order to get that, I have to fill in another form, probably even longer, evidencing my commitment to DEI. And then to get promoted as a judge, you have to show your commitment to DEI. So you can start to see why the judgments are coming out in the way that they're coming out. Fabianism is such an odd form of conspiracy, because effectively the Fabians themselves lose control over it. So they baked, Tony Blair baked all this into legal recruitment years ago, about 2005, around then. But that machine has just carried on, producing the same thing, producing judges. So if you imagine you're Keir Starmer and you suddenly go, the public are really upset with the judiciary. Judges seem politicised. I need to do something about this. You're immediately like, I can't. The system's just going to keep producing politicised judges. The system is working as intended. And all of these machines, and he probably doesn't even know, well, he'll know that one because he's a lawyer, but he wouldn't necessarily know that the police are in exactly the same problem. And he wouldn't necessarily know there'll be other areas of the system where the machine is just going ba-dum, 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 and producing not very gifted people. The government legal department, I don't consider it recruits on merit. It certainly recruits at an incredibly low level of pay, that it would be very difficult for most people to do it as a main job. And again, I think you have to evidence, commitment to DEI. You have to, again, what you've now got is a system where every minister is surrounded by a lawyer who's actually not very good. That's dangerous. Even if there wasn't, a sort of conspiracy, that's just inherently dangerous in and of itself. One of the ways that Lord Hermer himself, just singularly as a man, is breaking government, is that there is a threshold test given to civil service lawyers to advise the minister to say to yes or no to go ahead with a policy. And he's lowered the test for legal risk. So he's almost made it that if there's any legal risk, or any risk of being sued, which there almost always is, then the civil servant's job is to say to the minister, you can't go ahead. Now, if a government legal officer says that to a non-lawyer minister, there's no way that person's doing anything other than going, oh, okay, well, I best not do it then. That's just human nature. Suella Braverman had raised that bar to stop the civil service blocking everything. Really, we're going to need to fix the civil service, and we're going to need to fix... When I talk about the legal system, it's this as well. I will need to rip all of this out.
Dismantle the machine.
Yeah, I need to just get my hands into the cables and start ripping them out. And it's not going to be quite like that. It will be more surgical, but it does have to happen. First. Yeah. Good idea. Well, we'll have to do open heart surgery on the country, because we can't really put up that sign saying closed for maintenance. Yeah. Just the United Kingdom is currently closed for maintenance. Thank you for your attention in court. We'll have to sort of carry on. But in all seriousness, that's why an incoming government needs to be day one ready, and that's why it needs probably to have all of this drafted before it becomes the government. And that was a brilliant point that Douglas Carswell made, which is that you can't fix a bicycle while riding it. So we are going to need to fix all of this in advance, and I really hope people get their skates on and start doing it. I'm becoming much less aligned to any party because I don't really care who does this. It's much more useful, I think, to have people who are sort of slightly not party political, but who are there to assist in all of this. But it needs to happen. Otherwise, we're all screwed.
Steven Barrett, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.